Every other gospel starts with a human story, a birth, a baptism, a genealogy. John starts with the origin of the universe. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. A gospel writer chose to open not with a story about Jesus, but with a philosophical claim about the nature of reality itself. Right? Something categorically different is happening in John. To understand why John opens this way, we need to look at what these words meant in the ancient world. In the beginning, that's Genesis. John deliberately echoes the first line of the Hebrew Bible, but he adds something Genesis never says. Genesis says God created. John says the word was. That single verb, see was, carries enormous philosophical weight. In the Platonic tradition, being and coming into being are fundamentally different categories. Things that truly are, in the philosophical sense, are eternal and unchanging. Things that come into being are created, temporal, contingent. John places the word firmly in the first category. The word was. Then he says everything else came into being through the word. Then he uses the phrase come into being 3 times in the prologue, hammering this distinction. And this is not poetic decoration. It's a deliberate claim. Jesus belongs to the category of eternal being, not created existence. And that repetition, come into being 3 times, is not clumsy writing. In ancient Greek literary convention, repetition signals emphasis. John wants you to hear this distinction and not miss it. Each repetition deepens the point. Nothing that exists came into being without the Word. The Word stands on the other side of that divide. The prologue does something else remarkable. It previews the entire gospel in 18 verses. It functions as a thematic table of contents. Verses 1 and 2 introduce pre-existence and divinity, themes that return when Jesus says, "Before Abraham was, I am," in chapter 8. Verses 4 and 5 introduce light versus darkness, a motif that runs through the whole gospel. Verses 12 and 13 introduce birth from God, which becomes the entire Nicodemus conversation in chapter 3. Verse 14, the Word became flesh, sets up every moment where characters see or fail to see Jesus' glory. Verse 17 contrasts the law given through Moses with grace through Jesus. Nearly every major idea in John appears first here. 2 more details worth noting. At verse 6, John the Baptist appears, interrupting the poetic flow, specifically so the author can clarify. He was a witness to the light, not the light itself. This is a deliberate editorial move to establish hierarchy from the first page, and at verse 18, the phrase, God the only Son, appears. That sounds like language from a later Christian creed, not a narrative gospel. Nothing like it appears in Matthew, Mark, Luke, Acts, or Thomas, only John. So the prologue gives us the theology, but John's differences from the other gospels go far beyond theology. They extend to how the entire book is written. The synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, called synoptic because they share a similar perspective and much of the same material, are action-driven. Short episodes, rapid movement, brief dialogues. Jesus heals someone, teaches briefly, moves on. John is discourse-driven. Scenes open with a conflict or encounter, move into dialogue, then expand into extended monologue, where Jesus speaks for paragraphs or entire chapters. The pacing is slower, the speeches are longer, the theology is denser. This is not a flaw. It's a fundamentally different kind of gospel. One of John's most distinctive features is how he handles characters. In the synoptics, most people Jesus interacts with are unnamed types: a tax collector, a sinner, a Pharisee, a Syrophoenician woman. Even the longest synoptic dialogue with a non-disciple, the Syrophoenician woman asking Jesus to heal her daughter in Mark chapter 7, runs about 3 verses. 1 request, 1 response, done. In John, we get Nicodemus, a named Pharisee who comes to Jesus at night and receives an entire chapter of theological dialogue about being born again, the Spirit, eternal life, and judgment. Then there's the Samaritan woman at the well in John chapter 4. We learn she's had 5 husbands. We learn she's a Samaritan, a loaded social identity in first century Judea. We know where she lives, why she's at the well, and what time of day it is. Her conversation with Jesus runs 26 verses and covers living water, true worship, and the identity of the Messiah. By the end, she goes back to her town and becomes an evangelist. And these are among the most fully realized characters in any gospel. John doesn't just tell you what happened, he shows you who these people are. Uncommon confusion to clear up. Later, Christian tradition universalized the idea that Jesus pre-existed his birth, but this claim is only made in John among the 4 Gospels. Pre-existence means the theological claim that Jesus existed before his human birth. Matthew and Luke have birth narratives, but they do not assert pre-existence. Mark has no birth story at all. Right? And this makes John's prologue theologically unique, not just stylistically unique. Now that you can see what makes John different, here's how to use that knowledge when you sit down and read it. First, read John 1, verses 1 through 18 slowly. Identify each theme as it appears: light, darkness, life, witness, flesh, glory, grace, the Father-Son relationship. Then track those themes as you read the rest of the gospel. When Jesus says, I am the light of the world in chapter 8, recognize that the prologue told you this was coming. When Nicodemus asks about being born again in chapter 3, connect it back to verse 12. To all who believed, he gave power to become children of God. The prologue is your map. Second, try a specific comparison. Read the Syrophoenician woman episode in Mark chapter 7, verses 24 through 30. Then read the Samaritan woman episode in John chapter 4, verses 1 through 42. Notice the difference in length, detail, character development, and theological depth. That comparison makes everything we've discussed visceral. John doesn't start with a human story because for John, Jesus isn't merely human. The prologue isn't an introduction, it's a thesis statement. And once you understand it, you hold the key to the entire gospel.